economics, right? Everybody talked about things personal. It's not going to be very personal here, but it's not going to be the hardest lesson of economics that you've had, so relax. I'm working with statistics, with economics, and with history, but I'm also a cartographer, a map maker, and in my map-making activities, you cannot imagine how much alternative history I've seen. In every Reddit, subreddit page, you can find a map of some guy making what would have happened if Germany had won the Second World War. What would the world look like and stuff. I personally believe that the best alternative world, alternative reality that we could have is the one like here, where there's an ocean instead of Russia. I hope you feel the same way. I can feel that. That's good. The problem is that this option is not available for us, even for theoretical testing. However, a sort of a minor version of that we are going to be exploring today. And I hope it's going to be a bit of fun for you. So Lithuania itself has full of these alternative scenarios. You might remember a story of our Grand Duke Vytautas who never got the crown, right? What would have happened if he had got the crown? Would we be the biggest power? Maybe we would drown Russia somewhere, and that would be an ocean. Difficult to test. Another option, maybe you've heard of it as well, there was a famous geographer in Lithuania who wanted to shift large portions of Lithuanians to Madagascar to save the nation from deportations of the Soviet Union. Again, pretty difficult to test. However, as we'll find out in this talk, there are scenarios, there are ways that modeling alternative reality can really help us understand what was the impact of some major event. And in our case, that's going to be the impact of Soviet occupation on our living standards today. And that's how alternative reality can actually be useful. Now, this model of alternative reality in economics is not called alternative reality in research because everybody would think that it's some sort of a hoax. So they don't call it like that. But we will refer to it for the sake of fun. The idea is called synthetic control methods. It's something invented by a group of scholars led by Alberto Abadi. A couple of years ago, it's a recent method, and they first decided to test a very interesting phenomenon. So in the United States, there was a law passed in one single state of the country, which is California, to increase the tariffs on the cigarette consumption. And the goal was, of course, to decrease the consumption of cigarettes. Maybe some of you are familiarized with that, some of you are non-smokers. Basically, they wanted to see what was the actual impact of this law being passed in California in a causal way. You know, if you take any random state, any other state from the United States that did not implement this law, you could basically say, well, maybe if we compare these two states and what happens to the consumption levels or the sales of cigarette packs afterwards, the difference gives us the result. The problem that they noticed is that sales of cigarettes was going down not only in California, but across the United States. So how do you really know if the law works? So what they did is they first compiled a list of the states of the United States which seemed to be the most similar in California before the passage of the act, in population size, in the state size, in consumption of other things like alcohol, in the terms of consumption of beer, the number of young people in the state. So they listed the states of the United States which seem to be the most similar. to California. But in order to make this even stronger, they constructed an algorithm which not only picks out a weighted average of the states of the United States of America that seem to be the most similar to California, but also the weighted average that recreates the cigarette consumption trends for a long period of time almost identically to California. And as you see in this graph, this is what they got. A sort of synthetic California, a place which seems to recreate the patterns of the actual California almost identically before the passage of the act, but none of these states that are included in this weighted average of synthetic California had the law passed. So if we see such a great overlap between the actual series and the synthetic series, we can more or less safely assume that this is the most probable trajectory of the cigarette consumption in California in absence of the passage of the act. And in this graph, we clearly see that the impact of implementing the tax was very positive. Had they not implemented the Cigarette Tariff Act, the consumption of cigarettes would have most likely been much higher than it ended up being in the year 2000. And this is the causal impact of passage of this law. This hasn't been done for Lithuania. And a couple of years ago, we introduced the additional measures for alcohol consumption. Would be interesting to do. Maybe some of the students can come to my office and we can discuss this as a future bachelor thesis for you. But let's move on to Lithuania and see what kind of alternative scenarios we can think about for this country. So when I was, I still am finishing my PhD at Oxford, so the goal of my thesis, main goal, was to produce the first income statistics for the Baltic states since the independence back 100 years ago up until today, so that we understand how our economies grew through the dictatorships and democracies of the interwar period, through the occupation up until today. But you know, I'm a statistical geek and I love, this just for the sake of constructing the data. It's good fun. I hope you understand how fun it is to work with data, but I do. It's really good fun, but the problem is that it's not fun for everybody and people need something more interesting. And I decided to then look for the countries that seem to be the most similar to Lithuania before the Soviet occupation, but did not experience that. And one of the options that I picked was Portugal. Seemingly a natural comparable country because it also was a dictatorship, but it was not occupied by the Soviet Union, and I basically assumed that Portuguese economic growth trajectory would have been the same for Lithuania had it not been occupied by the Soviet Union. I sent it to my really competent economist friend, and he said, you gotta do something else. You gotta really look into this model called the synthetic controls that I have just mentioned, and maybe you can actually build something statistically strong to use your data. And that's what I did. So I compiled a huge amount of data for different countries across Europe and across the world, including Latin American countries, East Asian countries, that appeared to be similarly poor to interwar Lithuania before occupation. And I also managed to compile the economic growth data of these countries throughout the 100-year period. And then I gave this data to the algorithm, the same that I presented before, and got the results. And the results have probably three most shocking parts here. First is that this weighted average of countries that the algorithm provided, which consists of Finland, South Korea, Turkey, Ireland, and Iceland, seems to reproduce Lithuania's economic growth before occupation almost identically. So we have a good match. And we can more or less safely assume that how that average of countries which did not experience occupation behaved is the most likely path of Lithuania's economic growth in absence of Soviet occupation. And here we see two most interesting trends. First, before the 1980s, it seems like Soviet-occupied Lithuania is actually performing better than the hypothetical capitalist Lithuania. When I said that to people, they're not liking it. It's bad. The problem is here, of course, that economic growth data for the Soviet period needs to be taken with a sort of caution in terms of representing the actual living standards, but it seems to be true that for a very underdeveloped country, socialism or central command system, just as it does right now in China, could work for a bit longer than for most of Europe. However, in 1983, we already see a distinct break. Hypothetical, unoccupied, capitalist Lithuania steps up, overtakes the actual growth path of real communist-occupied Lithuania, and that trend is now unstoppable. So already by 1990, by the year we regain our independence, the difference is pretty clear. The negative impact of Soviet occupation is already very clear. Our living standards would have been about 25% higher than they were in the last year of Soviet occupation. By 2023, 2025, we see the difference even bigger. We do not experience the post-socialist recession, and right now, this year, with most probability, we would be living in similar living standards as Finland, France, New Zealand, about 35% better than we live today. And according to the best possible forecasts, we see that only in about 20 years we will finally reach the levels that we could have had in absence of occupation, which means that 50 years of occupation and life under socialism requires more than 50 years of market capitalism and independence to remedy the damage. And that is the causal impact of occupation. Now, I get this question a lot: how much sense does it make? You are taking in the Second World War. It's a big, a huge turning point. Also, it's a very long time period, and those, of course, are the limitations, and we economists work with limitations, and that's okay. The other question I receive is that, Lithuania was a dictatorship, there was Smetona there, and you're comparing it and you're assuming that Finland would have taken part of this weighted average of Lithuania in absence of occupation. But I then can show you these other people. This is Mr. Park, the dictator of South Korea. Under him, South Korea experienced the growth miracle. This is the dictator of Portugal in the middle, Mr. Salazar. And Portugal also experienced the economic growth miracle before democratizing. So who's to say that Smetona on the left here could not have lived out his days and provided us with a growth miracle? The good thing is that for the model that I'm creating, this does not matter. We're not trying to create the overall hypothetical alternative reality world. We're only trying to compile a set of countries, a weighted average of countries that did not experience this critical event, which is the Soviet occupation, and compare it with the actual path of Lithuania's growth to understand what the impact was just in our case. But beautifully enough, we end up constructing alternative reality. So my message here is first that alternative reality in general can help answer questions. We should not be afraid of it. There are models which stunningly are able to give statistical inference and strong statistical inference from constructing alternative reality. And the second lesson is that, particularly for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the alternative reality modeling revealed very highly negative impact of Soviet occupation. Thank you.